Let me start with a simple, verifiable, uncontested fact. In 1885, the Home Insurance Building rose 10 stories above the streets of Chicago. 10 stories of steel and glass and load-bearing ambition. We call it the first skyscraper. We give it a birthday, a father, William LeBaron Jenney, a story, clean and complete. We teach it in architecture schools, we print it in textbooks, we move on. But here's what we don't ask. Here's the question that nobody seems particularly interested in answering. How did they actually do it? Not the theory, not the blueprints, not the proud newspaper announcements, but the how, the logistics, the supply chains, the material science, the labour mathematics, the coordination of a workforce operating in an era of horse-drawn carts, hand-mixed mortar and, in many places, no reliable electricity whatsoever. How did men working with tools we would consider primitive, and I mean that literally, not poetically, how did they quarry, transport, mill, fabricate, hoist, align and permanently fix millions of pounds of dressed stone and structural steel to tolerances that would satisfy a modern engineer? How? That's not a rhetorical question. I mean it literally. How? I've spent considerable time studying the photographic record of early skyscraper construction, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say the record is incomplete. I don't mean it's sparse. Sparse would be understandable. Photography was young, film was expensive, documentation was inconsistent. Sparse I can accept. What I cannot accept is the specific and peculiar nature of what is missing. We have photographs of finished buildings, thousands of them. Gorgeous, detailed, high-resolution images for the era of facades, lobbies, ornamental ironwork of breathtaking complexity. We have portraits of the architects, the financiers, the politicians who attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies. We have newspaper coverage, speeches, dedications. What we do not have in the quantity or detail that the scale of these projects demands is comprehensive documentation of the construction process itself. The deeper you look, the stranger the contrast becomes. We're taught to think of this as progress, the heroic march of industrial civilization pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. And maybe it was. But progress usually leaves a trail. Usually there is a before and an after, connected by a long, messy, documented, failure-filled middle. We see that middle period for flight, from Cayley's gliders in the 1840s through 1,000 experimental disasters all the way to Kitty Hawk. We see it for steam power, crude Newcomen pumps, then Watts refinements, then the long unglamorous decades of improvement. We don't really see it for the buildings. Where are the 10-story buildings that struggled? Where are the 12-story buildings that partially collapsed, that required emergency retrofitting, that stand as monuments to learning curves and trial and error? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Magnificent buildings appear, fully formed, with a confidence and precision that seems to precede the documentation of how they were achieved. Let me take you to New York, 1902, the Flatiron Building, 22 stories. A steel skeleton wrapped in limestone and terracotta, tapering to an impossibly delicate point where Broadway meets Fifth Avenue at 23rd Street. Stand beneath it and tilt your head back. What you feel is not just admiration. It's a faint, creeping disorientation. Because something in your gut, the part that understands weight and gravity and the limitations of human effort, that part says, this should not be here. Now come with me to a different continent entirely. Melbourne, Australia. 1888. The Rialto Building, 8 stories. A confection of Gothic revival stonework that would look entirely at home on a medieval European cathedral, except it was constructed in a city that had been a colonial settlement for barely 50 years. 50 years, think about what that means. The people who built Melbourne's first permanent European structure were still alive. And now this, São Paulo, Brazil, late 1800s. Ornate neoclassical buildings with European flourishes appearing in a city that, by all colonial accounts, was still establishing basic infrastructure. Cairo, Buenos Aires, Shanghai, Bombay. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, not in one place, not in two, but across the world, simultaneously. In cities with vastly different resources, labour pools, climates and levels of industrialisation, all producing, within roughly the same narrow historical window, buildings of extraordinary scale and ornamental complexity. And that's where the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. I want to dwell on the labour question for a moment, because this is where the official explanation starts to buckle. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, construction began 1889. The main house alone contains 178,926 square feet, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, a banquet hall whose oak-beamed ceiling soars 70 feet. The stone used for its construction, Indiana limestone, was quarried in a different state, transported by rail to a dedicated spur line that had to be constructed specifically for this project, and then carved by artisans into thousands of individual decorative elements, each unique, each requiring skilled hands and precise eyes. They did this in 6 years with no power tools, no cranes in the modern sense, no computer-aided design, no laser levels, no prefabrication facilities. Contemporary accounts describe the workforce as numbering around 1,000 men. At peak, 1,000 men, for a building whose total decorative stonework, if laid end to end, would stretch for miles. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm asking you to sit with the math and feel what it produces, because what it produces, in me, is a question I cannot answer. Where did the expertise come from? A stonemason capable of producing that quality of work takes years, sometimes a decade, to develop his skills. You cannot conjure 1,000 of them on demand for a single project in rural North Carolina and then simply disperse them when it's done. Expertise propagates through lineages, schools, guilds, apprenticeships. You need the infrastructure of a tradition. What was that tradition? Where is its paper trail? If you've spent any time in alternative history spaces, and if you're watching this, you probably have, you've encountered the name Tartaria, or Tartary. A vast territory appearing on maps as late as the early 1800s, spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, labelled simply as Great Tartary or Chinese Tartary or Independent Tartary. On official maps, produced by official cartographers, published by official governments, and then gradually, not all at once but steadily, the name fades from cartography. The territory gets subdivided, renamed, absorbed. By the mid-1800s, it has largely ceased to appear as a distinct political entity. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that Tartaria was a secret empire that built your local post office. That would be the easy, comfortable, sensational version of this story. And I don't think the truth, whatever the truth actually is going to be that simple. What I am asking is this. Is it possible that the historical record of whatever existed in that territory has been more thoroughly erased than we've been led to believe? Is it possible that architectural traditions, engineering knowledge, material sciences, developed in that vast and poorly documented region, travelled through trade, through displacement, through the movement of peoples, into the building programs of the 19th century? Is it possible that what we're looking at in Chicago in 1885, in Melbourne in 1888, in Sao Paulo in 1891, is not the birth of something, but the final flowering of something much older? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The question isn't whether, the question is how much. Here's what I keep coming back to: the ornament. If you were building a new structure using genuinely new methods developed on the fly, assembled by a newly trained workforce operating at the frontier of technological capability, if all of that were true, you would expect the buildings to be functional, maybe even crude. The ornament would come later, once you'd solved the engineering problems, once you had surplus capacity, once the hard work of figuring out how was behind you, but that's not what we see. What we see right from the beginning is buildings that are maximally ornamented. Gargoyles and grotesques, egg and dart mouldings at every cornice, rusticated base courses, polished granite columns, terracotta panels depicting foliage, faces, mythological scenes, and these are not applied afterward, not tacked on as decorative afterthoughts. They are integrated into the structure. They are structural in many cases, which means whoever designed these buildings, whoever trained the people who built them, already knew, before the first stone was laid, exactly how complex it could be and how intricate it would need to be. That is not the behavior of a civilization figuring something out. That is the behavior of a civilization that has already figured it out. The deeper I went into the photographic record, the more this feeling accumulated. The Rookery Building in Chicago, 1888, its light court, rebuilt by Frank Lloyd Wright, but originally designed by Burnham and Root, features ironwork of such extraordinary intricacy that metallurgists today are not entirely certain how some of the joints were achieved at scale. The Library of Congress completed 1897 160,000 pieces of art, mosaic and sculpture embedded in a building constructed over 11 years using methods that, according to official records, were being invented as they went. That last phrase. Invented as they went. How many times does that explanation satisfy you before you start wondering what it's actually concealing? Every technology has an awkward adolescence. Cars looked ridiculous before they looked sleek. Aircraft were fragile death traps before they became instruments of reliable transport. Early photographs were blurry, early phonographs tinny, early computers room-sized and error-prone. Where is the awkward adolescence of the great 19th century building programs? Where are the transitional skyscrapers? The ones with misaligned facades, botched load-bearing calculations, decorative programs that started too ambitiously and had to be simplified halfway through. Where are the buildings that represent a civilization learning to do something it hadn't done before? They don't exist. Or if they do, they are so rare as to be statistically anomalous. What exists instead is an almost fully formed tradition, appearing suddenly, deployed across the entire world, executed with a confidence and consistency that implies deep institutional knowledge, and then, just as suddenly, fading. By the early 20th century, the ornamental tradition collapses. The Beaux-Arts gives way to the international style. The carvings disappear, the mouldings vanish, the grotesques come down, and the official explanation for why is that modernism was simply better, simply more rational, simply more honest about what architecture could be. But is that the whole story? Or is it also true that by the early 20th century, whatever reservoir of knowledge had been feeding the great building programs was running dry? That the craftsmen who knew how to carve those mouldings, fabricate that ironwork, lay that masonry, were aging, dying and not being replaced because the tradition that produced them had been severed at the root? The silence on this question is deafening. Here is a pattern I want you to notice. For almost every major building constructed in the late 19th century, the documentary record is incomplete in specific, interesting ways. Construction photographs often begin partway through the project. We have images of a half-built facade, but nothing from the foundation stage. Workers' accounts are scarce. The specialized subcontractors who executed the ornamental work are often listed in general ledgers, but otherwise vanish from the historical record. No workshops documented, no apprenticeship records, no professional guilds whose archives survive intact. I want to be precise about what I'm saying. I'm not saying the records were destroyed. I'm asking whether they ever fully existed in the forms we would expect. Because there is a difference between records that were lost and records that were never created, or were created within a tradition that did not organize knowledge the way Western bureaucratic systems do. What if some portion of the workforce that built these buildings came from a tradition where knowledge was transmitted orally, practically, not through written specifications, but through embodied craft carried in hands and eyes and muscle memory? What if that workforce dispersed or diminished, or simply reached the end of a lineage with no one to carry it forward? What would that look like in the archive? It would look like exactly what we have. Fragments, incomplete ledgers, photographs that start in the middle, names without biographies, skills without schools. The official explanation here isn't wrong exactly, it's just thin. And the thinner it is, the more it invites you to ask what might be underneath it. Let me return to the coordination problem, because I don't think we've sat with it long enough. In the 1880s and 1890s, there is no internet, no rapid worldwide communication. The telegraph exists, but it transmits words, not blueprints. International mail is slow, unreliable, frequently lost, and yet across 6 continents, in cities with no meaningful direct contact with each other, buildings are going up that share not just a general stylistic vocabulary, but specific ornamental details. The same proportional systems, the same constructional sequences, the same integration of structure and decoration, in ways that imply access to a common source. This raises a simple but critical question. What was the common source? The official answer is the architectural schools, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, primarily, which trained architects from around the world who then returned home and deployed what they'd learned. And yes, that explains some of it. The formal compositional principles, the classical vocabulary, the preference for symmetry and hierarchy. But it does not explain the craft. Because the architects design the building, but they don't lay the stone. They don't fabricate the iron. They don't carve the capitals. For that you need craftsmen, and craftsmen are not trained in architecture school. They are trained in workshops, in guilds, in apprenticeships that span decades. And those networks for the ornamental craft traditions of the late 19th century are spectacularly poorly documented everywhere at once. Not in Paris, not in Chicago, not in Melbourne, not in Buenos Aires. Everywhere, simultaneously, the record of where these people came from and how they knew what they knew is thin, fragmentary, and oddly consistent in its thinness. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to ask a different kind of question now, not about the buildings themselves, but about the process of forgetting. Collective amnesia, when it occurs, is rarely total. Usually there are holdouts, institutions that remember, communities that preserve, individuals who write things down that shouldn't have been written down. And sometimes those holdouts leave traces. In folklore, in regional building traditions, in the persistence of certain techniques in isolated communities, long after those techniques had ostensibly been forgotten everywhere else. What you find when you look for these traces is that they exist. In scattered pockets across Central Asia, in communities along old Silk Road corridors, in isolated mountain regions of Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus, there are masonry and decorative traditions whose relationship to the formal architectural programs of the 19th century West is, let me choose this word carefully, unexplained, not disproven, not impossible, just unexplained. Is that a connection? I don't know. Is it a coincidence? Possibly. But once you see it, the coincidences start to cluster in uncomfortable ways. And the official explanation, which essentially requires you to believe that the same styles, the same techniques, the same formal solutions emerged independently in a dozen different places within the same narrow historical window, that explanation starts to feel less like scholarship and more like a story someone decided we needed to believe. The evidence suggests something much larger than what we've been told. I don't have a clean conclusion for you. I want to be honest about that. What I have is a pattern of capability appearing faster than it should, of records being absent where they should be abundant, of coordination occurring where coordination should have been impossible, of a tradition flourishing and then collapsing within a single century without adequate explanation for either its rise or its fall. What I have is the question of Tartaria, not as a simple empire with a capital and a flag, but as a placeholder for something we haven't properly named yet. A repository of knowledge, perhaps, a network of craft traditions, a civilization, or a confluence of civilizations whose relationship to the built world of the 19th century has been at minimum inadequately investigated, and at maximum, I don't know. And I think that's honest. What I keep returning to in the end is the buildings themselves, the ones you walk past every day in any city with a 19th century core, the ones whose facades you've stopped seeing because familiarity has made them invisible, Look at them again. Look at what it would take to build them. Look at what it would take to know how to build them. And then ask yourself, does the story we've been given, the heroic march of industrial progress, the self-taught artisans, the newly invented techniques, does that story actually account for what you're looking at? Or does it merely describe it, the way you can describe a magic trick without explaining how it works? Because there is a difference between description and explanation, between the official record and the full truth, between what we're told happened and what the evidence, the silent, surviving, still standing evidence in stone and iron and terracotta, what that evidence, impervious to revision, stubbornly, magnificently present, actually shows. They built things we struggle to explain. They knew things we cannot trace. And then somehow that knowledge was gone, not transferred, not evolved, not superseded, gone. And nobody, not the historians, not the archivists, not the architectural scholars in their well-funded universities, nobody seems particularly troubled by that. Maybe they should be. Maybe we all should be.